Join us in this podcast as we interview Lincoln Juice, a 3-time stand-up paddleboarding world champion and lifelong ocean athlete from Australia. Lincoln has also made a name for himself in surf lifesaving, surfing and sailing. He has recently turned his focus towards ultra-endurance events. We've worked with Lincoln as he took on the Yukon River Quest, a 715-kilometre race down the Yukon River in Canada, where he won the event for stand-up paddleboarding, smashing the course record in the process. We hope you find Lincoln's story as interesting as we have. Welcome everyone to Radix Nutrition's podcast with me, Mike Rudling, where we discuss all things health, performance and nutrition, from the design process behind our products to the amazing feats of the people who use them.
So as I said, you sort of do a huge amount of sports and we're really interested to hear a bit more about those. So can you tell us a bit about what you do and how you got into them?
Yeah, it's quite of an interesting story, right? Like I've always been, growing up as a bit of an athlete that kind of jumped between a few different sports and never really kind of settled, I guess. I was pretty lucky. Most kids growing up in Australia here, we did a lot of surf lifesaving, like the Ironman racing stuff, and the same in New Zealand, and played a bit of rugby and all sorts of sports, and really kind of found my niche in, ocean sports. In that capacity, I guess I really struggled to kind of narrow it down, whereas I always wanted to go Ironman racing, but I still wanted to go surfing and sailed a lot, and it just kind of, for me, it was lucky. I've never really needed to focus on one exclusively. And that's for better or for worse, right? Like a lot of the time, I kind of wish maybe I did focus on one, but I've been fortunate the last couple of decades to be able to kind of mix and match and compete in a few different sports and get different experiences out of, I guess, each one separately.
I'm really curious if you have a favourite one, because you do so many and you seem to do quite well in so many as well. I'm just wondering if you've got a favourite and why.
A favourite one? That's pretty hard, I guess, for me. I think each sport kind of, I get a different experience and get kind of something different out of it, right? So like in my teenage years, I was quite focused in the surf Ironman racing world, which is it can be quite intense. So a lot of the training for that kind of stuff is you're doing your 3 sessions a day. You're in the pool swimming with up to like Olympic level swimmers in the morning, and then you're paddling a surf ski in the afternoon, which is often where a lot of the Olympic level kayakers come out of. So growing up kind of doing that kind of ocean racing, quite intense lifeguard style racing in the surf was kind of my whole world up until I was about 20. And for me, that really kind of taught me, I guess, how to perform and how to kind of just have that exposure into high level sport and how, I guess, just being around really good swimmers and really good Ironman and really good kayakers, you learn how those kind of guys and girls train hard, right? And how people go to race at high levels. And for me, I was able to kind of take that and that whole world into a few different sports. I also kind of grew up kind of idolizing a lot of even mountain climbing and a lot of those kind of adventure sports where it's a little bit more not high performance, but it is in a different way, and it's in that kind of adventure and that kind of outdoor area. And for me, I think the sailing and these kind of longer paddle races really kind of tick that box for me, and I get excited about challenging myself in that kind of mental capacity over multiple days and finding out, I guess what you're capable of doing. But in saying that, I do enjoy the kind of the high performance. I did, especially when I was a little bit younger, that high performance side of kind of wake up in the morning and going to the pool and trying to improve yourself and shave seconds off your time. So for me, it's very much about being in different worlds, and I'm lucky. I think at the moment it kind of keeps me quite fresh, whereas I can kind of focus on the paddling stuff and then kind of step away for 6 months and focus on some sailing kind of projects. And then obviously the road coming up next year, I'm quite excited about. But it's just honestly, for me, it's just a bit of a journey. it's trying to challenge myself in areas that are a little bit foreign, a little bit different, and just try to learn, I guess, as I go and see what kind of projects or sports or events I want to kind of do after it once I kind of get through these ones.
Just a quick question for our listeners. So in surf lifesaving, what level did you reach in competition?
Yeah, I was quite competitive in kind of the age group stuff. I won a few state titles and was quite close on winning a national title up until about the under-19s and the Opens. And for me, it was a bit of a journey. Like I always wanted to grow up to be like a Nutrient, like the professional series Ironman, and you'd idolize those guys and you train with those guys, and it was cool to kind of try and follow that path. I had a bit of a fork in the road, so to speak, when I was kind of 18, 19. I didn't qualify for the series, and it was this whole, like, I can keep grinding away and doing the same stuff and really trying to achieve that goal, or I could go and kind of dabble in that kind of adventure world a little bit. And for me, like idolizing other sports so much, it was kind of too hard to turn down going and doing some of those longer paddleboard races and just kind of trying, I guess, sports that are similar but a little bit different. Is that kind of?
I was thinking the same thing. I mean, what drew you to these other sports? Because you've gone off into some incredible endurance sports using your background of how familiar you are and your family's history in the ocean. But there must have been a draw that's taken you towards these amazing endurance events.
Yeah, I think I'm not actually sure why I'm so addicted to them. But I think it's that personal kind of challenge, right? Like I was quite fortunate about 18, 19 when I wasn't super stoked on doing the Ironman racing and just missed out. I had the opportunity to kind of jump in the stand-up paddleboarding world, and like back then the stand-up paddleboarding was kind of this bit of this mosh between like a lot of good Ironman racing and a lot of good surf ski paddlers. There were some very good outrigger paddlers that had come across to the stand-up, and it was kind of this little scene where you could go and race the best outrigger paddlers in the world from Tahiti, and the best ocean surf ski paddlers were also paddling the stand-up. So it was this kind of like this scene where you were doing these long 2 or 3 hour races, and you were not just racing against the same people you'd raced week in, week out for a number of years. You were really racing against like paddlers that were kind of the best in their paddling craft jumping across. And for me, that kind of buzzed me up a little bit, and you got to kind of dabble, I guess. It was more of an explosion for myself into that what there's so many other kind of events and racing and sports out there, and the whole adventure kind of sport world following on from that is so big, and there's so many different events that you learn a lot from, right? Like if you're kind of doing the same racing and you're kind of racing against the same guys week in, week out, you only get that kind of, you get to a point where it's not different anymore, and it's not as exciting. So I kind of followed along with that, and then voice sailed a little bit, and then kind of got into the sailing a little bit more, and it's just kind of, honestly just jumped between the both and just trying to find events and projects that excite me to keep training and keep motivated and have that little bit of an edge.
When you're jumping between like that, between sports, can you talk me through how your training actually would change? It's quite an interesting thing to me, because obviously when you have high level athletes, usually they've dedicated a very long period of time and they're training very specifically for one thing, but you seem to jump between and be able to adapt and do quite well. So how does your training actually change when you change your focus?
Yeah, that's kind of a tricky one. I don't think I'm definitely not the best at being able to do it as well as a few other kind of multi-sports athletes. Like I said, I guess my background, my teenage years and my early 20s was very dedicated to paddling, and it was very much like that. Like it was the sole focus, whether it was the Ironman racing and then the stand-up paddle and the ocean racing. It was quite focused and dedicated to those kind of sports. Follow on, I had a few years off with COVID and that kind of a reset and started kind of falling into more of that adventure racing stuff. And for me, I've been really fortunate. I've been able to use that paddling background the paddling and endurance sport background quite well and transfer it over physically. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge, especially throwing in like a lot of the sailing projects and stuff I've been doing now, where it demands a different level of set of skills and a different kind of physical ability to do well. And even I got back on the boat yesterday after doing this long kind of all this paddling work leading in, and I really felt like my hands were a bit sore and a few little like haven't hit the gym as much as I'd like to over the last 6 months, and you can kind of feel it, right? You jump in and you go, oh my God. But yeah, it's just very much for me at the moment about trying to focus on a certain project for 6 or 8 months and develop my body while I might be jumping between the sports. Really trying to focus on changing my body and kind of preparing for that one kind of project. The paddling, I guess I'm fortunate enough that we've had so much leading into it. It's more about now doing races like the Yukon. We're focusing on more of the mental side of the preparation when preparing to kind of go, okay, like I'm going to have to be out there by myself for days at a time. I'm not going to have a crew or a team to rely on, or I can't ask somebody for advice, and getting that mental side of being completely self-sustainable, and then flip it back into like a sailing environment. Maybe if you're sailing two-handed like we have been, and you suddenly got somebody there in your ear 24/7 when you're racing. So it's, for me, there's a lot of different elements to that kind of can merge together. But I guess like you see so many, I mean, in the snow and across a lot of sports now, there's so many great athletes that can jump from being a very competitive world to doing different side of projects and just kind of transferring those skills across. And I kind of draw a bit of inspiration from that, I guess.
I'm fascinated to learn how you prepared for the Yukon project, but possibly we just introduce the project first and tell our listeners what it was about, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so the Yukon Paddle Quest is it's been a canoe race for about 25 years, up in the Yukon region in Canada. So it's, if you don't know, it's super remote. Like it's pretty much like the end of the earth up there. Like it's almost inland from Alaska. So you get the really kind of extreme temperatures in the winter and in the summer, and you just don't get the humidity that kind of Alaska gets with their kind of snowfall. So in the summer, it's quite hot it was about 40 degrees some days when we were there. And you're in the middle of nowhere and quite exposed. So it's as a canoe race, it's kind of a bit of a cultish race, and there's a lot of paddlers that kind of come out of the woodwork from a lot of different backgrounds, I guess, as well as a lot of traditional kind of canoe paddlers from Canada and places that are very, very good canoe and paddling countries. So the stand-up's only been in the event maybe 4 or 5 years, I think, and it was quite a push to kind of get the stand-ups into the event. So early on, it was, once we got in, it was all the guys and girls that have done it the last couple of years. A big push has been on the stand-ups to kind of not embarrass ourselves and prove we can actually do the event. And especially the early years, they were trying to beat all the quicker craft across the line, just to prove that like you were kind of deserved to be in the event and we're not going to be a liability.
On that, how does your speed compare to the other classes?
It's quite interesting actually. So the surf skis are quite a lot faster, but the kind of the canoes, the traditional canoes where they have like a single sided paddle and they sit down, we're pretty similar in speed, and I think that's to do with they're a little bit heavier and they drag through the water a little bit more, especially when they're all loaded up with their gear. So for us, it was quite surprising. So I think I ended up third overall in the solo division, which was, mind you, we like pushed pretty hard the whole way. But I guess it's not as slow as people think. And I think the biggest advantage in those kind of races, that race specifically, is that a lot of the races to do with navigation and to trying to find the fast water in the river. So you're running down river the whole time. So one side of the river is a little bit quicker than the other, and just being able to stand up and have that kind of vision on the river, we often found that we would be in the quicker water a lot more than some of the paddlers. When they were sitting down, they get tired and they can't kind of see where they are as much. And I don't know, maybe that kind of helps a little bit, especially when you're tired and you're not really, it's not so much a speed race, it's just kind of a consistency thing.
So I guess a question for our listeners, it's a 750k paddle down the Yukon River, one of the most remote places in the world. How do you choose that event?
That's a good one, and it's one of those ones for me. It's kind of been a bit of a bucket list event. So in 2019, I won my second stand-up paddleboard world title, which is my third. So I won a prone paddleboard world title and the two on the stand-up, and I was a little bit burnt out leading into that. I really, really struggled kind of leading into the event, and so I'd won the year before, and then backing it up was quite a challenge. Like I kind of felt like I'd done everything for myself that I wanted to do in the sport and in paddling, and I was kind of ready for some other challenges.
And
to win,
it's 750k. Is that a typical distance for you in your career, or was that longer than you've?
Not at all. Like, in all honesty, like, so when I won our world title, it was on the short course as well. So we don't race anything longer than like 2 hours. There's a rogue. There's one race in Hawaii that's about 4 hours. But it's like, yeah, we don't race anything that's longer than, everything's between half an hour to 2 hours at most. So to wrap my head around this, it was a huge challenge, and I was just burnt out, and I was just looking for something that was interesting and was different. And there's a few of my friends or people I guess I knew had done this race before. A guy I actually coached a little bit leading into this race had done it a couple of years ago, and I always looked at them as like lunatics, right? I'm like, there's no reason, I've got no desire to paddle up far on a board or to suffer like that. But for me, it was just about a different challenge. And the more I thought about it, the more I kind of grew on me. And I said, you know what? Like, I've got that paddling background. I've got the kind of physical background that I know I could probably do it. But it's just another challenge to see if I can kind of apply myself to. And it kind of made me reinvigorate, I guess, my sport and really enjoy what I was doing again. Just throwing myself so far out of that comfort zone.
I guess just the next question, how do you go about preparing for something that extreme and that far outside of your experience?
And that was the toughest question, right? Like, I really found there was so many layers involved, and I probably drew on skills I took for granted from sailing a lot to kind of start preparing for being outdoors and preparing for a multi-day event. But yeah, there was so many levels to preparing for an event like that I hadn't really overlooked until a few months before, when we started really knuckling down and into it. And there was the two sides. There was a lot, and it was quite confronting, but at the same time, I guess when you break it down and you process through an event like that, it was remarkably achievable. And something we actually spoke about a lot was that there was a bit of a saying. Peter Allen, my support guy that had done it a couple of times, kept saying, is if you can paddle for 3 hours, you can paddle for 60 hours. It's not so much a physical thing, and it wasn't so much like you have to do crazy amounts of training and do all this kind of hero level of preparation. It's just about doing all the little things right and making sure all your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted, and you've got your gear right and all those little things. It wasn't, the physical side is kind of irrelevant once you get to a certain level, right?
And it's fully unsupported, is that correct?
No, not fully unsupported. So there's 2 support stops. So basically, once you start, it's about 25 4 hours to the first stop, and you're allowed a support cry at that stop. And then we took about 5 hours, but it's typically about 6 or 7 hours between the two stops. And the second stop, you get the same support guy, and then it's unsupported to the finish. So you have there's two stops, and you've got to take a mandatory of 10 hours at the stops. Doesn't matter how you split that up. But you've got to take the 2 10-hour stops, and then the rest of it's kind of unsupported. So it was good and bad in a way, I think, like, because it's so supported, you can push yourself to a level that, like, you don't need to worry about seizing. You just get there and you fall in your bag and you'll have food prepared for you and it's okay. But at the same time, it's like an open invitation to just hammer yourself to the ground, because, once you get there, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of the other stuff and a lot of the kind of like the first day and the last day, both 24-hour legs effectively kind of unsupported. And there's a lot of navigation and a lot of interesting, unique things about that river, and the fact that, like, it's because it's a glacial runoff, the river changes every year, and the maps are the hand drawer maps from like 100 years ago. So there's a lot to it, I think, mentally more than, I guess, physically I found especially.
I wanted to ask, Lincoln, there's so many factors going on, and you talk about, the river and it's up in the Yukon. Were there any challenges you weren't expecting that you ran into that kind of set you back or surprised you?
Yeah, completely. I think for me, at the end of the day, it's also a race. And that was kind of the big thing leading into it, is like, as well as it's this big challenge to paddle for that long and stuff, like, it is a race, and there was 3 or 4 really, really good guys that were very well prepared to race and to really kind of hurt for the distance. And preparing for that was probably my biggest challenge. And then being in that situation, right, where you're 24 hours into the race and there's a minute between you, or you can see each other, and you can't physically break away, but you want to. But going through that side of it for me was probably the biggest challenge. So we did the first leg to the first stop was about 24 hours, and it involves everything from paddling across a lake that's about 60 kilometres long, and there's no tidal assist, and we copped a few big storms, like quite quick and intense storms, but we copped some storms coming across to everything from 10 hours later, you're paddling through islands down the river, and it's quite navigational and quite challenging, and just that kind of level of intensity I think I'd never experienced before consistently for that kind of distance. And that in itself was probably the biggest hurdle. So coming into the first stop, we were probably about a minute apart, and that was only because I kind of got a little bit lucky at the end and kind of put the hammer down. But it was like a minute after 24 hours is not much, especially when you're not kind of traveling. It's like paddling, you don't travel up quick, right? You kind of, it's a bit of a grind.
So do you choose to stay together? I mean, do you draft? Are there any other tactics, or is that just you couldn't get away from each other?
It's an interesting one. So I kind of wanted to break away. I'm quite confident in my own paddling, and I wanted to break away the first day, in the fact that, like, I know how I feel in the first day. Like, I know I can physically, from my background, I could probably be a bit of a stronger paddler, that I could break away, but I didn't know how I'd feel after 60 hours. I didn't know at the end of the race I might have, like, could be completely screwed, and so I was hopeful I'd have a little bit of a buffer. But I spent myself pretty hard in the first day. I think I broke away 3 times and was pulled back in 3 times. And from the last one, it was like, all right, like I was hanging on for dear life on the draft, and it's a tricky one. Like, the other guys were quite happy to draft each other and pace for the rest of the race, and it's a tough one, right? Like, I guess it's like a lot of those kind of drafting adventure sports where you draft when you can, and if you see an opportunity, you'll go and you'll notice the other guy goes. And I think the biggest thing with us is that when you stop to have a rest break, you kind of can't, like a bike or anything, you can kind of still roll. We have to kind of sit down and stop to kind of get our food and rehydrate and fill our water packs up. So it was always a game of, like, do you take the extra couple of seconds and let them and lose the draft and then be hydrated for the next 2 hours, or do you sprint and maybe risk falling down the track by not taking the proper time to kind of hydrate and fuel up? So it was an interesting one, and that I think mentally stressed me more than I kind of took into account.
So you talk a bit about how you choose to eat and hydrate, and that's all happening on the board, obviously, with this 24-hour shift. So can you explain for our listeners a little bit more about your fueling strategy? Because obviously it's not as straightforward as it normally might be in an adventure race or an outdoor setting, because you're out on the water, right? And it's all on your board with you. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, my fueling strategy was to kind of keep it simple. And notoriously, like, I'm not probably the best person when it comes to nutrition and being prepared for these and having a plan in place for these kind of races. And also to have paddled that far, so I was quite unsure how I was going to go on day 2. So general rule of thumb with the stops is you try to limit your stops to having a minute every hour on the hour. So we were kind of like, you'd be down, you'd watch your watch, you'd limit yourself to your 60 seconds up and go. I had the idea to maybe have some longer stops like as the race progressed, but you just couldn't with the kind of the intensity of always having somebody just behind you or just in front of you. You really kind of couldn't take more than your minute. Water's quite tricky, so we carry about up to about 5 litres of water on the board. When we want to change that over, whether it's got electrolytes in it or pure water, it's kind of up to us as we go. We'll swap each pack out, but to fill it up, you've got to use the river water, and there's certain spots because of the floods this year you kind of couldn't fill it up. So you're filling it up, you're putting your purification tablets in it, you've got to wait your half an hour. So planning the water, I guess, down the track was quite important. But food-wise, I kind of ran, I guess, 2 different setups. When I wasn't pushing super hard, when I was kind of in my mode, in control, I can actually digest kind of real food. So I was relying on my veggies, fruits, lots of nuts, some avocados, kind of anything that's kind of a little bit high in fats and sugars, and just to kind of get that real food in when I could. Challenge is standing up, and the way, well, for me especially, I really struggle to kind of digest if I'm working hard at all. So it's kind of this fine line between when I can go from that, or when do I go to the gels and the kind of the glucose and the lollies and just try and rely on that kind of stuff. And for me, the first night I probably relied on that too much, and I potentially missed a few food stops, and then come 24 hours in, I was laying flat on my board, wishing it was anywhere but there. So the biggest challenge too, I guess, for me was that you had these 2 rest stops where you were based roughly 5 hours at each, and you wanted to get in, fuel up, and get as much sleep as you could. So that's very much when like kind of having the recovery smoothie shakes that you guys make, and then the high calorie, the 800 calorie meals
The ultra range.
came into play. The ultra range, that's it. So they came into play like quite quickly, in the fact that like I really, really struggled to kind of digest something, and I just needed to get as much fuel in as I could in a small meal, get it in, and then get to bed as quickly as I could. So relied on those a lot kind of coming into the stops. And actually on the last day we used I had one of the ultra meals on the board, so we filled it up at the stop, sealed it up, and then for the first 4 or 5 hours into our last kind of 24-hour leg, every minute I'd stop down and have 2 mouthfuls of that. And it was just nice to have something that was warm. It was 1 a.m., and it was nice to have something that was warm and just kind of taste a little bit different, taste like food, right? Wasn't just having cold nuts in the morning, and it was nice to kind of keep me going. But yeah, it was a bit of a mixture, and for me it was very much of a learning thing, because I've done the sailing stuff. You're not as stressed physically. You can kind of eat when you want or eat as you go, and then doing like 2-hour races, you're just kind of on the gels and stuff like that. So it was kind of a middle ground for me, trying to learn and figure out as I went.
Yeah, we think it's a really cool sort of aspect of these ultra endurance events is in nutrition, and as you sort of at the start of the podcast said, it's something that is very much addressed in the high performance setting, that being your traditional sports, right, where it's a very controlled environment and trainings and competing is all very controlled, and then you take it into the outdoors and you have these massive ultra endurance events, and people often forget that nutrition's just as important, right, and if not, it potentially is more important. So that's something that we absolutely love, and hearing about your strategy is really cool, because there's all these other factors that start to come into play. It's not just what you can eat that's best for you, but for you, you know, it's have you got water to hydrate? Is it hot water? Digesting while you're going? There's all these different factors, so it's a really interesting thing to hear about.
I got a question. What would you do differently if you did it again?
That's a really cool one, and quite honestly, like a lot. Like I feel so foreign to a lot of this stuff, and like it's interesting talking to even like a lot of the backcountry skiers and stuff, for example, that like you go, like there's so much for me to learn in how to kind of be fueled up for multiple days at a time. And I think I ran the mistake of kind of being, and it comes back to race intensity, right? Like I was kind of too intense early on, and I relied a lot pretty heavily on some gels and lollies and things like that early on that I would in like a 2-3 hour race, because I just couldn't digest anything else. I felt like I just couldn't get anything down. I felt like crap. As soon as I'd go into my stomach, I really struggled. And about maybe 20 hours into the first leg, it was about, I would have been like 1 a.m., right? And that's when I'd made a breakaway, and then I just faded. And I remember just sitting on the board and just feeling like, not just flat, but like sick. Like I was throwing up a little bit and really couldn't stand up, and just felt like my guts were cooked and everything, like acid reflux and everything. I just felt like shocking. And I think that kind of came down to just not fueling up, just kind of being a little bit intense and a little bit heavy-headed early on in the piece. And it was amazing like how much that hurt. That came back to me like 20 hours later, right? As opposed to even my last leg, where I went into it a lot more relaxed, and I kind of fueled up in the right way for the first 6 hours really, really well. And then by the end of that, like I felt amazing. Like it just the, I guess, the learning and the preparation. And it's one of those things as well, as I've always been somebody who doesn't prepare as well, in the fact that I don't test a lot of things. Like, okay, that'll work, or I'll take for granted that process makes sense. I'll continue to do that. Whereas then I actually got on the board, and it was like little things like taking my jacket on and off was a process, because I had to put my feet over in the freezing water, and it was like, shit, like I probably should have thought about that one before I came over. But I guess it's one of those things, right? You don't realize it until you're there, and you go, oh God, should have tested that.
So on the pacing, I mean, you've gone from a background in, I'm not sure if they'd be a sprint sport, but my background's in road racing, where they're unpleasantly long, typically. An hour's a sprint. But there's a huge difference in pacing, right? You've been in events at sort of 1 to 3 hours, and you're going up to something that's multi-day. Do you race off just perceived effort and perception, or do you use heart rate? Do you use speed over ground? I mean, how do you do that for that event?
So paddling is quite an interesting one, right? Like we would use perceived effort and heart rate primarily. The reason being is that I guess it's the same as road riding in a way, that like because the conditions change so much. It's speed over ground is so volatile, and especially like you could have 5 knots of headwind or a bit of a sea state, or whatever the waves are doing, like changes it so much. And we do a lot of training in the flat water and kind of controlled environments to try and replicate sessions and stuff. And even that, like even on a rowing course, it's quite hard for us to replicate sessions consistently, just because of the conditions and the wind, right? So that it's a lot to do with perceived effort and heart rate. But even with something like this, I really struggled coming into it, knowing and understanding that. It's
hugely different. I mean, again, 20 times longer than what you normally do.
Yeah, and the biggest thing too for me was that suddenly carrying all this weight on the board, right? And that completely changed my rhythm and threw up my rhythm. Even training and preparing for that, like we were trying to replicate that as best I could, but like a lot of the paddling athletes aren't that big. Like we don't need to we just need to have high turnover, right? And be quite aerobically fit. It's not so much of a strength sport. And as soon as you put a huge pack on the board and then you're just slowing down your rhythm and your rating, it changes the game completely. And I really struggled with that leading into it, and even in the race, I didn't really know how I'd go pace-wise because it's just such a different kind of world.
That leads me into another question. When I was road racing, you have good days and bad days. You have days where everything flows really nicely, and other days where every pedal stroke just sucks. Nothing, no rhythm. It's all hard work. How do you over multi-days, you must have gone through some stretches of time there where just everything was difficult. How do you deal with that?
I'm not well. Well, complaining to myself. But I guess it's the same as a lot of those kind of events, right? It's like they did the same as road racing. It's like you get to a point where it sucks and you feel like crap, but you can almost pedal yourself. You can almost work yourself back into feeling good. And that's something I know, like I learn a lot with swimming. Like swimming's quite a sport where it's very feel orientated, and for whatever reason, some days you just have no feel. And for me, being able to take that kind of that's like probably a skill I've developed from swimming and that kind of high performance sport is going, okay, I feel like shit this morning, but I've got to force myself to like almost work myself to feeling good. And it was a challenge. Like it was by myself out there. It was quite a challenge. And I think the biggest part of it is because the water is so different as well. Like we do a lot of paddling on salt water, where you go into a river like that where it's fresh water firstly, so you're a little bit stickier, the board's heavier, and then because it's running water, because it's running down the river, it's so different. It's boily. It almost requires a different kind of stroke as well. Like and I was learning as we're going, and it was quite interesting actually. A good friend of mine, Travis Grant, paddled the canoe in the race, and he's in a 4-person canoe, but he's probably one of the best ocean paddlers on the stand-up and out, a lot of other paddling craft. And we both commented that it's very, very different kind of paddling in the river. And we just didn't take it for granted. Just little, just very small changes in your stroke. But all these little things add up, right? Like little things in your stroke that have to be different, the board being heavier, rating being different. Suddenly there was lots of moments where I felt like I was just paddling like crap, or I was working hard and going nowhere, so to speak. So it was a kind of a learn on the fly moment, I think, for a lot of it.
It's interesting you mentioned swimming. So before cycling, I was a swimmer, and I was very focused on hand feel, water feel, just all feel. And a pool's obviously a highly controlled environment, and then you start sea swimming and everything sucks. You're catching in the wrong areas. There's a wave, you go to breathe, you're drowning. It's just a mouthful of water. And I went through into cycling with a pool swimmer's mindset, where a highly controlled environment, you're just expecting a good day, everything dialed in with how you feel. And then you just have to learn still to perform when everything goes wrong. Everything feels bad. You have equipment breakages. And just that ability to learn to just acknowledge that something's gone wrong and let it go and move on. You still got to perform, right? And you're saying on the river, you can go through a difficult period. It can last for hours, but no matter how bad it is, you got to get through it. And there's only one way you're going to get through it. So you got to carry on. It's probably pretty difficult when you're out there by yourself or with a teammate, but fairly alone.
Yeah, and that's it, I guess. I'm sure it's the same as cycling, right? Like and cycling, it'll be the same. Like when it's going wrong, you know it's going wrong. You can't hide. Like it's quite obvious, right? Like everyone else knows knows it's not going right and you're struggling. And I think a lot of these sports are like that. And we were saying in sailing a lot, it's like knocking off the highs and filling in the lows and just trying to keep that level head and just be completely emotionless almost. And that's something I've always struggled with a lot, is like very much emotional athlete. I'll ride my highs and then ride them into the ground when they fall off the cliff. But just trying to be a little bit less like that and go, okay, well, that sucks, or this has happened, this is the fact that's happened, how do I improve? How do I get out of that? And I mean, you see it with so many athletes, right? Like tennis players and even kind of mountaineers and stuff. Is like they have shit days and you see them go, oh, it's a shit day, and I move on. And just, I guess it's just trying to get into that mindset, isn't it? Just trying to just keep pushing and just keep doing what you know, and you know it will get better at some stage.
I think the more we deal with ultra endurance athletes, it's just that mental resiliency is always just such a fascinating subject. And I think in an event like you've been through, it's where the great are separated from everyone else, right? You can't really get ahead when everyone's going through a good patch. And fascinating. But
Would you do it again, Lincoln?
Would I do it again? I don't know. I would like to do it again, and this is going to sound crazy, but I'd like to do it again because I know there was moments out there I probably like I learned so much, for example, like step it back, like I learned so much, and this has really kind of been a step in that kind of ultra adventure endurance racing, where mentally I learned so much, physically I learned so much, and I'd like to do it, maybe not this race again. I'd like to do other similar projects probably, in the fact that like I'd like to perfect, I think, what I did. Like there's lots of mistakes I made out there that even now going, okay, I would do that different, or I'd change that, or I would probably, my first 24 hours was pretty average. And I guess that maybe that's just the performance side of me going, okay, like it'd be nice to step away and do it the best I could do it. But yeah, like it just so, you know, I just feel like, especially the mental side, right? Like I feel like I'm learning so much from like all those ultra athletes, and it's just a lot to learn. And yeah, maybe one day.
Another way of wording that, your result in this race, you were third. Is that right?
Yeah, so I ended up first in the stand-up paddleboard division, but we ended up third, which was actually really good in the overall solo division with the kayaks and the canoes and stuff. And that's kind of, I think the best of stand-up place is about fifth. So it's not too bad. Like I had I pushed pretty hard and I guess it paid off. But yeah, it was.
So put another way, what's the best result you think you could get? Could a stand-up paddleboard win if you went back and you had a perfect race?
Don't know. I don't think so. I probably not. Result-wise, probably not. I think result-wise, I probably did the best I could. It was more so kind of like, I guess, the time. It'd be nice to go back and do a quicker time maybe, but like, it once again, it's a learning thing. And if I knew what I did the last day or the first day even, like, it would have been a lot more enjoyable and pleasant experience. But then you kind of have to go through that, right, to figure it all out, I guess, in these kind of events.
Although you say all that after breaking the course record, right?
Yeah. So I mean, it was one of those tricky ones again, right? Is that it's so river dependent, and they had so much snow this year, so the river was running quite quickly, and it's one of those things. It's like we knew we were going to be very close to breaking the record, and then the last day, like it was, got to a point where I was quite comfortably in front, and I was actually starting to enjoy my paddling and going, okay, like I haven't got far to go. And I say that, I looked at the map straight after, and it was like 8 hours to go, and I was like, holy shit. But it was one of those things. Is all right, like you don't often get an opportunity to break a course record, especially on a race that's quite, I guess, it's a bit of a landmark in the paddling world. And it's okay, so I may as well just leave everything out here and try and break it by as much as I can and leave a good kind of mark on the race. But yeah, it's just, I guess it's one of those things too, right? Is like coming from a world that's so controlled and race controlled and training is quite controlled. It's like when you're out there and you're relying on your navigation and things like that, there's lots of times where you'll go around a couple of islands in the river and you go, oh, did I go the fastest way? I'm not sure. And you can't tell. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But like with a bit of sleep deprivation and all those other things, it's like you go around the island, you're like, oh God, I went the wrong way. Or no, I've screwed this up, or I've lost now, and things like that. That I probably think I probably could have done a lot better. But it's just, it's learning, and it's preparing for these things a little bit better and being a little bit smarter the second time through.
Awesome. Can you talk us through what you've got coming up next?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of things coming up next, and it's probably more so into this adventure world, which is I'm pretty excited about. First up, I'm doing the Sydney Hobart Yacht Race again this year. So we're back in the two-handed division, and I'm pretty fortunate to be working with it's called Sunfast Racing. So it's the Canoe Yachts boat program. So we've got so it's a two-handed race. So there's going to be only two of us on board the boat again this year, and we've got a really good boat kind of lined up, and we've just started sailing it this week. So that should be a kind of a fun project for myself. And then next year I'm going to be rowing the Indian Ocean Row with a couple of other Aussie blokes. So I have no idea what I'm in for with that, and I feel like so far out of my depth. Other than it's going to be miserable and I'll suffer for a few days, but excited for that again. I guess in that same kind of unknown capacity.
Awesome. Well, I think unless you have any questions for us, Lincoln, I think we've pretty much covered everything we wanted to ask you about. It's been great having you on.
Yeah, easy, fellas. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for your time. And yeah.